The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Nexus Technologies' 42nd floor boardroom, where 15 of the most influential figures in the tech industry sat around a polished mahogany table that cost more than most people's cars. The air hummed with the quiet confidence of power and wealth, punctuated only by the soft clicking of expensive fountain pens and the occasional rustle of $100 suits. Comment below what state or country you're watching from, because what's about to unfold in this Silicon Valley boardroom could happen to brilliant minds anywhere in the world. At the head of the table sat Marcus Blackwell, 43 years old, his salt and pepper beard perfectly trimmed to suggest both youth and gravitas. His custom-tailored navy suit from Savile Row hugged his frame with the precision that only $7,000 could buy. Marcus commanded attention effortlessly, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Behind him, a massive digital display showed the sleek logo of his latest innovation, the Quantum Sync processor that promised to revolutionize artificial intelligence computing. The board members leaned forward with hungry anticipation. Margaret Sinclair, the silver-haired venture capital legend whose firm controlled billions in tech investments, tapped her manicured fingers against her tablet. To her left sat Dr. Harrison Webb, the former MIT professor whose endorsement could make or break any technology venture. The other faces around the table belonged to CEOs, senior partners, and industry titans who collectively shaped the future of global technology markets. Near the back of the room, almost invisible in a simple charcoal business suit that she had bought off the rack 3 years ago, sat Lydia Chen Blackwell. Her shoulder-length black hair was pulled back in a modest ponytail, and her only jewelry was a plain wedding band that caught the light as she nervously adjusted the papers in her lap. To most observers, she appeared to be exactly what Marcus had introduced her as, his supportive wife who occasionally attended important meetings to witness his triumphs. Lydia's presence went largely unnoticed by the power brokers who filled the room. She had learned over the years to make herself small, to blend into the background of Marcus's professional world like expensive wallpaper. Her engineering degree from Stanford and her years of late-night innovation sessions had been carefully erased from the narrative that Marcus presented to the world. In his version of their story, she was simply the devoted spouse who managed their home life while he built technological empires. Marcus clicked his presentation remote with the flourish of a maestro beginning a symphony. The massive screen behind him illuminated with technical diagrams that made several board members squint with confusion, though they would never admit their lack of understanding. The Quantum Sync processor appeared in rotating three-dimensional glory, its intricate pathways and revolutionary architecture gleaming like digital artwork. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had delivered this presentation a dozen times in private. "What you're looking at represents 5 years of intensive research and development. This is not merely an incremental improvement in processing technology. This is a complete paradigm shift that will render current AI limitations obsolete within the next decade." The board members murmured their approval, nodding with the synchronized enthusiasm of people who understood that they were witnessing something potentially worth billions. Margaret Sinclair raised an eyebrow with interest, her fingers already calculating potential returns on investment. Dr. Webb leaned forward, his academic curiosity clearly piqued by the technical specifications that flowed across the screen. Marcus continued his presentation with the smooth confidence of a natural performer. The processor's unique architecture allows for parallel processing streams that current technology cannot match. We're talking about AI systems that can learn, adapt, and evolve at speeds that will make today's most advanced networks look like pocket calculators from the 1980s. As the technical details filled the room, Lydia felt her chest tighten with a familiar mixture of anger and disbelief. Every specification that Marcus presented with such authority, every innovative feature that he claimed as his breakthrough, had originated from her mind during countless sleepless nights in their home workshop. The revolutionary cooling system, the unique data pathway architecture, the breakthrough in quantum classical interface design, all of it had emerged from her sketches, her prototypes, her years of patient experimentation. She remembered the night 18 months ago when the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place in her mind. Marcus had been asleep upstairs while she worked in the basement, surrounded by circuit boards and half-assembled prototypes that filled every available surface. The moment of breakthrough had come at 3:17 in the morning, when she finally solved the heat dissipation problem that had been plaguing the design for months. Her hands had trembled with excitement as she drew the final schematic, knowing that she had created something that could change the world. The next morning, Marcus had found her asleep at her workbench, the completed design spread around her like a paper constellation. He had kissed her forehead gently and told her how proud he was of her hobby, how cute it was that she enjoyed playing with electronics. Then he had carefully photographed every schematic before heading to work, telling her that he wanted to show his colleagues how talented his wife was at her little engineering games. Now, watching him present her life's work as his own masterpiece, Lydia felt the familiar burning sensation in her throat that came from swallowing words that needed to be spoken. Her fingers gripped the edge of her legal pad so tightly that her knuckles went white beneath her olive skin. She had learned through painful experience that interrupting Marcus during his presentations only led to humiliation and accusations of attention-seeking behavior. The next slide appeared on the screen, showing projected market penetration and revenue forecasts that made several board members sit up straighter in their chairs. Marcus gestured toward the numbers with obvious pride, his gold wedding band catching the light as he pointed to particularly impressive projections. These figures are conservative estimates based on current market analysis, but I believe we're looking at technology that will capture 60% of the enterprise AI market within 3 years of launch. Margaret Sinclair cleared her throat delicately, a sound that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose approval could fund entire startups. "These technical specifications are certainly impressive. However, I'm curious about the development timeline. 5 years seems remarkably fast for innovations of this magnitude. Can you walk us through your research methodology?" Marcus smiled with the confidence of someone who had anticipated this question. The breakthrough came through persistent iteration and a willingness to challenge conventional approaches to quantum classical integration, he replied smoothly. The key insight was recognizing that traditional heat management strategies were fundamentally flawed for this type of parallel processing architecture. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she heard Marcus repeat almost word for word the explanation she had given him during their dinner conversation 6 months ago. She remembered the evening clearly, how excited she had been to finally share her technical breakthrough with someone who would understand its significance. Marcus had listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and encouraging her to elaborate on the most complex aspects of her design. She had felt so grateful for his interest, so validated by his enthusiastic response to her work. Dr. Webb leaned forward with academic curiosity gleaming in his eyes. "The quantum classical interface design is particularly elegant," he observed. "Did you collaborate with any university research teams during the development process? This level of innovation typically requires extensive peer review and collaborative refinement." Marcus chuckled with just the right amount of humble confidence. "Sometimes the best innovations come from thinking outside the academic establishment, Harrison. I've always believed that breakthrough technology requires the freedom to explore unconventional approaches without the constraints of institutional groupthink." The answer was perfectly crafted to appeal to the entrepreneurial mythology that dominated Silicon Valley culture, the romantic notion of the lone genius working in isolation to change the world. The board members nodded their appreciation for Marcus's intellectual independence, their expressions showing the kind of admiration typically reserved for visionary rebels who rejected conventional wisdom. Lydia felt her face flush with a mixture of shame and rage as she watched the room full of brilliant, successful people accept Marcus's carefully constructed narrative without question. She wanted to stand up and scream that every single innovation he was claiming had come from her mind, her hands, her sleepless nights of patient experimentation. She wanted to show them the thousands of pages of notes in her handwriting, the progression of prototypes that documented her journey from initial concept to final breakthrough. Instead, she remained silent in her chair, playing the role of the supportive spouse that Marcus had assigned to her years ago. She had learned through bitter experience that challenging Marcus's version of events in public only led to carefully orchestrated humiliation that left her looking foolish and attention-seeking. He was a master at redirecting confrontation into concern for her emotional state, transforming her legitimate anger into evidence of instability that required his patient management. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus fielding technical questions with the smooth expertise of someone who had thoroughly memorized information rather than genuinely understanding it. He had always possessed a remarkable talent for absorbing complex concepts quickly enough to discuss them convincingly, even when his comprehension remained fundamentally surface level. This skill had served him well throughout his career, allowing him to present himself as an expert in fields where his knowledge was borrowed rather than earned. As the formal presentation concluded, the board members erupted in enthusiastic applause that echoed off the glass walls with the sound of potential fortune. Margaret Sinclair was already making notes on her tablet, clearly calculating investment strategies. Dr. Webb nodded with obvious approval, his academic credentials adding weight to the technology's credibility. The other faces around the table showed the kind of excitement that came from recognizing an once-in-a-decade opportunity to be part of something revolutionary. Marcus basked in the adulation with practiced grace, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about patent protection and licensing strategies. He mentioned casually that all intellectual property was securely protected and that the company owned exclusive rights to every aspect of the technology. The legal framework was airtight, he assured them, with documentation that would withstand any challenge to their ownership claims. Lydia felt her stomach drop as she heard Marcus discuss patent ownership with such casual certainty. She realized with growing horror that he must have filed patent applications using her designs without her knowledge, claiming credit for innovations that belonged to her both intellectually and legally. The magnitude of his betrayal began to crystallize in her mind, revealing a pattern of systematic theft that went far beyond simple marital selfishness. As the meeting began to wind down, Dr. Webb raised his hand to ask one final question. "Marcus," he said thoughtfully, "I'm curious about your wife's background. Lydia, isn't it? Does she have any technical training that contributed to your development process?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward Lydia, who felt her heart begin to race with unexpected attention. She opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus quickly intervened with a patronizing laugh that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Oh, Lydia has always been fascinated by my work," Marcus said with the indulgent tone typically reserved for discussing children's hobbies. "She enjoys tinkering with electronics in her spare time, but she wouldn't really understand the technical complexities we've been discussing today. Her background is in liberal arts, not engineering. She's incredibly supportive, though, and I couldn't do what I do without her taking care of everything else in our lives." The dismissal was delivered with such smooth confidence that the board members immediately accepted his characterization without question. They smiled politely at Lydia with the kind of benevolent condescension typically shown to spouses whose primary contribution was emotional rather than intellectual. Dr. Webb nodded understandingly, clearly satisfied that he had been appropriately considerate in acknowledging her presence. Lydia felt the familiar burning sensation in her chest that came from being erased in real time, her actual expertise and contributions reduced to cute hobby status in front of people whose respect she had once hoped to earn. She managed to smile and nod graciously, playing the role that Marcus had scripted for her even as rage built like pressure behind her calm exterior. As the board members began to pack up their materials and exchange business cards, Marcus continued to accept congratulations and schedule follow-up meetings. The energy in the room crackled with the excitement of a successful presentation, with handshakes and promises of continued collaboration. Several people mentioned specific technical aspects of the presentation that had particularly impressed them, unknowingly praising Lydia's innovations while she sat invisible in her corner chair. The meeting finally concluded with plans for due diligence processes and investment timelines that would transform Marcus's presentation into a multi-billion-dollar reality. As the board members filed out of the conference room, they chatted animatedly about market disruption and competitive advantages, their voices carrying the confidence of people who had just witnessed the future of technology. Marcus remained behind to organize his materials, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a performance well delivered. He hummed quietly to himself as he packed up his laptop and presentation materials, already mentally planning his next moves in what promised to be a career-defining success. Lydia sat motionless in her chair, watching her husband bask in credit for her life's work while the weight of his betrayal settled over her like a suffocating blanket. But behind her calm exterior, something fundamental was beginning to shift, a quiet determination that would soon reshape everything Marcus thought he knew about power, ownership, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating the woman whose genius had built his empire. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt endless, the silence between Marcus and Lydia thick with unspoken tension. Marcus hummed softly, still riding the high from his successful presentation, while Lydia stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, someone who had learned to make herself invisible while her life's work was stolen piece by piece. As they reached their Tesla Model S, Marcus finally broke the silence with the satisfied tone of someone savoring victory. "That went even better than I expected," he said, settling into the driver's seat with obvious pleasure. Margaret Sinclair looked genuinely impressed, and Harrison Webb's questions showed real technical interest. "I think we're looking at a funding round that could value the company at over $2 billion. Lydia buckled her seatbelt mechanically, her mind drifting back to a night 3 years earlier when everything had begun to unravel. She remembered sitting in their home office at 11:30 on a Tuesday evening, surrounded by technical journals and prototype components that covered every available surface. The breakthrough that would eventually become the quantum sync processor had emerged from her subconscious like a gift, a solution to processing bottlenecks that had been frustrating her for months. The memory was crystal clear, preserved by the intensity of that moment of discovery. She had been working on thermal management systems for parallel processing architectures, trying to solve heat dissipation problems that seemed insurmountable with conventional cooling approaches. The answer had come while she was examining a spider web in the corner of their basement workshop, the way the silk strands distributed stress across multiple anchor points without any single failure point. That night, she had worked until dawn, sketching furiously as the complete solution unfolded in her mind. The revolutionary cooling system used biomimetic heat distribution patterns that could handle processing loads far beyond anything currently available. She had filled 17 pages with detailed technical drawings, mathematical calculations, and component specifications that represented months of theoretical work compressed into a single evening of inspired creativity. Marcus had found her the next morning, asleep at her drafting table with ink stains on her fingers and equations scattered around her like evidence of genius. He had brought her coffee and kissed her forehead tenderly, telling her how amazed he was by her dedication to her engineering hobby. She had been so grateful for his understanding, so relieved to have a partner who encouraged her passion for innovation rather than dismissing it as frivolous. She remembered explaining her breakthrough to him over breakfast, watching his eyes light up with what she had interpreted as genuine admiration for her work. Marcus had asked thoughtful questions about the technical specifications, encouraging her to elaborate on the most complex aspects of her design. He had even suggested that she patent the innovation, praising her for creating something that could have commercial applications. But 3 weeks later, she had discovered that Marcus had photographed all of her sketches and notes while she slept. The revelation had come accidentally, when she had borrowed his laptop to check her email and found a folder titled Work Projects that contained high-resolution images of every page she had filled that night. The timestamps showed that he had taken the photographs at 5:17 in the morning, just hours after her breakthrough. When she had confronted him about the photographs, Marcus had responded with hurt confusion that made her feel guilty for questioning his motives. He explained that he had been so impressed by her work that he wanted to show his colleagues at Nexus Technologies how talented his wife was. He claimed that he had planned to surprise her by arranging for some of the company's engineers to review her designs and offer professional feedback. His explanation had been delivered with such apparent sincerity that Lydia had felt ashamed for doubting his intentions. Marcus had a gift for making his deceptions sound like acts of love, for transforming theft into generosity through carefully chosen words and emotional manipulation. She had apologized for questioning him and thanked him for wanting to share her work with people who could appreciate its technical merit. The pattern had repeated itself dozens of times over the following years, each incident following the same basic script. Lydia would achieve a breakthrough in her home workshop. Marcus would express enthusiastic support and encouragement, and then her innovations would mysteriously appear in his professional presentations as evidence of his own creative genius. The transformation was always subtle, presented as collaborative development rather than outright theft. 6 months after the thermal management breakthrough, Marcus had been promoted to Senior Vice President of Innovation at Nexus Technologies. The announcement had praised his revolutionary approach to heat dissipation in parallel processing systems, describing technical innovations that Lydia recognized as direct applications of her original designs. When she had mentioned the similarity to her own work, Marcus had smiled indulgently and explained that great minds often think alike. The next major theft had occurred 18 months later, when Lydia solved a critical problem in quantum classical interface design that had been stumping research teams at major universities for years. She had been working on the problem as a personal challenge, using quantum mechanics principles she had studied during her graduate work at Stanford. The solution had required integrating concepts from multiple engineering disciplines in ways that conventional approaches had never attempted. Marcus had been even more supportive of this project, encouraging her to work late into the night and bringing her meals while she labored over increasingly complex calculations. He had praised her brilliance repeatedly, telling her that she was wasted in her current role and deserved recognition for her intellectual gifts. His encouragement had felt like validation after years of having her contributions minimized or ignored entirely. But when Marcus had presented the quantum classical interface design to the Nexus Technologies board 6 months later, he had claimed credit for every aspect of the innovation. Lydia had watched the presentation from the back of the room, her heart breaking as her husband described her most challenging technical achievement as his own inspired breakthrough. The board members had been genuinely impressed, praising Marcus for thinking outside conventional paradigms and approaching the problem from multiple theoretical perspectives. The systematic nature of the theft had become undeniable when Lydia discovered that Marcus had filed provisional patent applications for 17 of her innovations without her knowledge or consent. She had found the documents while searching for tax records in his home office, patent applications that listed Marcus Blackwell as the sole inventor for technologies that had originated entirely from her research and development work. Each patent application contained detailed technical specifications that matched her original sketches and prototypes with disturbing precision. Marcus had even copied her unique notation systems and mathematical approaches, reproducing her work so completely that anyone comparing the patents to her original notes would immediately recognize the theft. The applications covered everything from processing architectures to cooling systems to interface designs that represented years of her most innovative thinking. When she had confronted Marcus about the patent applications, his response had been a masterclass in manipulative gaslighting that left her questioning her own perceptions of reality. He had expressed shocked hurt that she would accuse him of stealing her work, reminding her that everything they created together belonged to both of them as a married couple. He claimed that he had filed the patents to protect their shared intellectual property, ensuring that her innovations would be legally secured rather than vulnerable to theft by competitors. Marcus had transformed her anger into guilt with surgical precision, making her feel selfish for wanting individual credit when their marriage was supposed to be a partnership where they shared everything. He had reminded her that his position at Nexus Technologies gave him the platform to bring her ideas to market, whereas her background in liberal arts provided no avenue for commercializing her technical innovations. He was helping her achieve impact that would be impossible on her own. The conversation had ended with Lydia apologizing for questioning Marcus's motives and thanking him for protecting their joint intellectual property through proper legal channels. She had felt foolish for interpreting his business acumen as betrayal, grateful to have a husband who understood how to navigate the complex world of technology commercialization that was foreign to her academic background. But the pattern of systematic appropriation had continued relentlessly, with Marcus finding increasingly sophisticated ways to claim credit for her innovations while maintaining the facade of marital collaboration. He had hired intellectual property attorneys who specialized in technology transfer, building a legal framework that would make challenging his ownership claims virtually impossible. The lawyers had praised Marcus for his foresight in documenting and protecting such valuable innovations. Dr. Evelyn Torres, the lead patent attorney at Harrington, Kim & Associates, had become a frequent visitor to their home during the development of the QuantumSync processor. Lydia remembered sitting in their living room while Dr. Torres explained the importance of proper intellectual property documentation, listening to discussions about patent strategy that treated her innovations as Marcus's personal assets requiring legal protection. Dr. Torres had a sharp, calculating manner that made Lydia uncomfortable, her designer suits and expensive briefcase projecting an image of someone who viewed everything through the lens of billable hours and competitive advantage. She spoke about Lydia's technical breakthroughs as if they were natural resources that Marcus had discovered and now needed to exploit efficiently. The attorney never addressed Lydia directly during these meetings, treating her as irrelevant background presence while the important adults discussed serious business matters. The legal team had worked with remarkable efficiency to establish Marcus's ownership of every significant innovation that emerged from Lydia's workshop. They had created detailed documentation that would satisfy any patent challenge, building paper trails that supported Marcus's claims to revolutionary insights in fields where he possessed no formal training or practical experience. The lawyers had even coached Marcus on technical terminology, ensuring that he could discuss his claimed innovations with apparent expertise. Watching Marcus present her life's work to the board that morning had been the culmination of years of systematic theft, but Lydia was beginning to realize that it was also something else entirely. It was evidence. Every confident claim Marcus made about innovations he had never created, every technical detail he presented with borrowed expertise, every patent he claimed without rightful ownership was creating a legal vulnerability that could destroy him completely. As they drove home through the Silicon Valley traffic, Marcus continued discussing his plans for the technology commercialization that would make them both incredibly wealthy. He talked about licensing deals and manufacturing partnerships that would bring her innovations to global markets, describing a future where her work would revolutionize entire industries. He seemed genuinely excited about sharing the success with her, apparently believing his own narrative about their collaborative genius. But Lydia was no longer listening to his enthusiasm about their shared future. She was thinking about patent law, about intellectual property theft, about the difference between legal documentation and actual invention. She was remembering her original sketches, her prototype development, her detailed research notes that established clear timelines for every innovation Marcus had claimed. She was beginning to understand that his apparent legal sophistication might actually be the weapon that would ultimately destroy him. The foundation of Marcus's empire was built entirely on stolen intellectual property, documented with such arrogant confidence that he had created an irrefutable paper trail of his own fraudulent claims. Every patent application, every presentation, every legal document that established his ownership was simultaneously evidence of massive intellectual property theft that could result in criminal prosecution and civil penalties that would obliterate his career and personal wealth. For the first time in years, Lydia felt something besides helpless anger as she contemplated her situation. She felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally identified her opponent's fatal weakness, the single point of failure that could bring down his entire carefully constructed facade. Marcus had always been too arrogant to imagine that anyone would challenge his version of reality, too confident in his manipulative skills to consider the possibility that his victim might fight back. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand with apparent affection. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Lydia," he said with what sounded like genuine gratitude. "Your support means everything to me, and I promise that our success will be worth all the sacrifices you've made for our partnership." Lydia smiled and squeezed his hand in return, her expression showing nothing but loving appreciation for his acknowledgement of her contributions. But behind her calm exterior, she was already planning her next move in a game that Marcus didn't even realize had begun. She was thinking about evidence, about documentation, about the kind of legal representation that specialized in intellectual property theft rather than protection. She was thinking about justice. The next morning found Lydia sitting in the Starbucks on University Avenue, her laptop open to what appeared to be a harmless genealogy website, while she waited for her 10 o'clock appointment. To any observer, she looked like another suburban wife researching her family tree, complete with a floral notebook and reading glasses that made her appear older and less threatening. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, she was conducting reconnaissance that would determine the trajectory of the rest of her life. 3 days had passed since the board meeting, and Lydia had spent every moment planning her investigation with the same methodical precision that had characterized her engineering breakthroughs. She had realized that gathering evidence against Marcus would require the same systematic approach that had made her innovations possible, building proof one documented piece at a time until the complete picture became undeniable. Her first step had been cataloging every innovation that Marcus had claimed over the past 5 years, creating a comprehensive timeline that matched his professional announcements with her original development work. The process had been more disturbing than she had anticipated, revealing a pattern of theft so systematic that it amounted to industrial espionage conducted within their own marriage. Marcus had stolen everything from minor efficiency improvements to revolutionary breakthroughs, building his entire reputation on her intellectual property. The documentation had taken her 47 hours to complete, working in careful increments while Marcus was at the office or traveling for business meetings. She had photographed every sketch, every prototype, every page of calculations that established her as the true inventor of technologies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The evidence was overwhelming, but Lydia knew that overwhelming evidence meant nothing without proper legal representation and strategic presentation. At exactly 10 o'clock, a woman in an understated gray suit approached her table with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling complex litigation. Diana Reeves was 45 years old, a partner at Morrison, Chun & Associates who specialized in intellectual property theft cases involving technology companies. Her reputation in Silicon Valley was legendary, built on a track record of destroying executives who thought their wealth and connections made them untouchable. Diana settled into the chair across from Lydia with efficient grace, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the situation with the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. She had agreed to this preliminary meeting based on the brief description Lydia had provided over an encrypted phone call, but her expression suggested skepticism about the claims of systematic patent theft by a respected technology executive. "Mrs. Chun Blackwell," Diana began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone whose time was extremely valuable. "Your phone call described allegations that would constitute one of the most significant intellectual property theft cases in Silicon Valley history. Before we proceed, I need to understand exactly what evidence you believe you possess and what outcome you're hoping to achieve through legal action." Lydia had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, practicing her presentation until she could deliver the key points without revealing the depth of her preparation. She needed to appear like a wronged wife seeking justice rather than a calculating strategist planning systematic destruction. The difference would determine whether Diana took her case or dismissed her as another bitter spouse with unrealistic expectations. "My husband has filed patents claiming exclusive ownership of 17 major innovations that I created in our home workshop over the past 5 years," Lydia said quietly, her voice carrying just the right mixture of hurt and determination. "He has built his entire career at Nexus Technologies on my work, and now he's planning to sell the company based on technologies that legally belong to me. I have original sketches, prototypes, and development records that prove I am the actual inventor of everything he's claimed." Diana's expression shifted subtly, her professional skepticism giving way to genuine interest as she recognized the potential scope of the case. Intellectual property theft on this scale could result in criminal prosecution, civil penalties in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and personal liability that would destroy Marcus both professionally and financially. If Lydia's evidence was as comprehensive as she claimed, they were discussing one of the most significant fraud cases in technology industry history. The attorney leaned forward slightly, her demeanor becoming more focused as she began to understand the magnitude of what Lydia was describing. "Mrs. Chun Blackwell," she said carefully, "if your allegations are accurate, we're talking about systematic patent fraud that could result in federal criminal charges. This would not be a simple divorce matter or civil dispute. We would be pursuing allegations that could send your husband to prison and result in the complete forfeiture of assets obtained through fraudulent claims. Lydia felt her pulse quicken as Diana's words confirmed what she had hoped, but hadn't dared to believe. The scope of Marcus's theft was so extensive that it crossed the line from civil wrongdoing into criminal fraud, creating legal jeopardy that would terrify even the most confident defendant. His arrogance had transformed him from protected executive into vulnerable criminal, exposed to prosecution that could destroy everything he had built on stolen foundations. I understand the serious nature of these allegations, Lydia replied, maintaining her composed exterior while excitement built in her chest. I'm prepared to provide whatever documentation and evidence is necessary to pursue this matter to its full legal conclusion. My husband has systematically stolen my life's work and claimed credit for innovations that represent years of my research and development. I want justice, regardless of the personal consequences. Diana studied Lydia's face with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to recognize authentic determination versus emotional impulse. She had handled enough cases involving powerful men and betrayed spouses to distinguish between clients seeking vindication and those capable of sustaining the brutal litigation process that major intellectual property cases required. Something in Lydia's steady gaze suggested steel rather than sentiment. The attorney pulled out a digital tablet and began making notes with efficient precision. If we're going to pursue this matter, we'll need to establish a clear timeline of invention, document the original creative process, and prove that your husband knowingly filed false patent applications claiming work that belonged to you. This will require extensive evidence gathering, expert testimony, and probably coordination with federal investigators who handle intellectual property crimes. Lydia reached into her purse and withdrew a flash drive that contained carefully organized digital copies of her evidence. This contains photographs and scans of my original sketches, development notes, and prototype documentation for all 17 innovations that my husband has claimed, she said, handing the device to Diana with steady hands. The files are organized chronologically and cross-referenced with the dates of his patent applications and professional presentations. Diana's eyebrows rose slightly as she accepted the flash drive, clearly impressed by the level of organization that Lydia had demonstrated in preparing her evidence. Most clients came to initial consultations with boxes of random documents and emotional grievances, not systematically cataloged proof that could support federal prosecution. The thoroughness suggested either exceptional preparation or professional legal experience that Lydia had not mentioned in their preliminary conversation. As Diana inserted the flash drive into her tablet and began reviewing the files, her expression grew increasingly serious. The evidence was even more comprehensive than Lydia had indicated, with clear documentation that established not only the timeline of invention, but also Marcus's systematic appropriation of each innovation for his professional advancement. The paper trail was so complete that it would be virtually impossible for any defense attorney to challenge the basic facts of the case. Mrs. Chun Blackwell, Diana said after several minutes of review, this evidence is extraordinary. If these documents are authentic, your husband has committed fraud on a scale that will attract federal attention and potentially trigger a complete investigation of Nexus Technologies. Are you prepared for the level of scrutiny and publicity that this case will generate? High-profile intellectual property prosecutions become media spectacles that affect everyone involved. Lydia had spent considerable time thinking about the public consequences of pursuing legal action against Marcus, weighing her desire for justice against the personal cost of becoming the center of a widely covered legal battle. But her anger at years of systematic theft had crystallized into cold determination that made media attention seem like a minor inconvenience compared to allowing Marcus to continue profiting from her stolen work. I'm prepared for whatever consequences result from pursuing the truth, she replied with quiet conviction. My husband has built his entire career on lies and theft, and he's planning to become even wealthier by selling a company based on my innovations. If exposing his fraud requires public scrutiny, then that's a price I'm willing to pay for justice. Diana nodded with obvious approval, recognizing the kind of client commitment that made complex litigation possible rather than merely theoretical. She had seen too many potentially strong cases collapse because clients weren't prepared for the emotional and practical demands of sustained legal warfare against well-funded opponents. Lydia's calm resolution suggested someone who understood exactly what she was choosing and why. The attorney spent the next 30 minutes outlining the legal process that would be required to pursue intellectual property theft charges against Marcus and potentially Nexus Technologies itself. The case would likely involve federal prosecutors, forensic accounting experts, and technical specialists who could authenticate Lydia's evidence and assess the commercial value of her stolen innovations. The timeline would be measured in years rather than months, with no guarantee of outcome despite the strength of her documentation. As their meeting concluded, Diana provided Lydia with detailed instructions for preserving additional evidence and maintaining operational security while the investigation developed. The most important requirement was that Lydia continue behaving normally around Marcus, avoiding any indication that she was building a legal case that could destroy his career and personal wealth. Premature discovery would give him time to destroy evidence and prepare defenses that could complicate prosecution. That evening, Lydia sat in her home workshop surrounded by the prototypes and equipment that had generated the innovations Marcus claimed as his masterpieces. The space looked exactly as it had for years, filled with circuit boards, testing equipment, and half-completed projects that represented her ongoing creative process. But everything felt different now that she understood her work's true value and the extent of Marcus's systematic theft. She carefully documented the current state of every prototype, taking high-resolution photographs that would establish the physical evidence supporting her legal claims. The process was methodical and time-consuming, but Lydia approached it with the same patient precision that had characterized her engineering breakthroughs. Each photograph, each measurement, each detailed note was another piece of the case that would ultimately destroy Marcus's fraudulent empire. Upstairs, she could hear Marcus on a conference call discussing the sale negotiations that would transform Nexus Technologies into a multi-billion-dollar acquisition target. His voice carried the confident enthusiasm of someone who believed himself on the verge of unprecedented success, completely unaware that his victim was building the evidence that would expose his crimes to federal prosecutors. The irony was perfect in its symmetry. Marcus's greatest triumph would become the foundation of his complete destruction, his stolen innovations providing the evidence that proved his systematic fraud. His arrogance had prevented him from recognizing that the quiet wife he had dismissed and exploited possessed both the intelligence and the documentation to demolish everything he had built on her stolen genius. 3 days later, Lydia received the call that confirmed her legal team was ready to proceed with federal criminal referrals that would trigger the investigation phase of her case. Diana's voice carried barely contained excitement as she explained that preliminary review had established grounds for prosecution that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The evidence was so comprehensive that federal prosecutors were already expressing interest in moving forward with charges that could result in decades of prison time for Marcus and complete asset forfeiture for crimes committed through systematic intellectual property theft. As Lydia hung up the phone, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice finally becoming possible after years of systematic exploitation. Marcus had taught her that power came from controlling information and manipulating perceptions, lessons that she was about to turn against him with devastating effectiveness. The investigation phase would take several months to complete, but the outcome was already determined by the weight of evidence that Marcus's own arrogance had created. His careful documentation of stolen innovations, his confident patent applications, his detailed presentations claiming credit for her work, all of it had become the rope he would use to hang himself when federal prosecutors revealed the true inventor behind his claimed genius. Lydia returned to her workshop and continued her methodical documentation, no longer working in secret, but preparing for the moment when everything would be revealed and justice would finally balance the scales that Marcus's greed had distorted for far too long. She had learned to be patient through years of systematic theft, and now that patience would deliver the complete destruction of everything Marcus had stolen from her brilliant mind. 6 weeks after her meeting with Diana Reeves, Lydia stood in the mirror of their master bedroom, adjusting the simple black dress that Marcus had chosen for tonight's celebration. The Nexus Technologies acquisition announcement party would be held at the St. Regis, San Francisco, where 300 of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley would gather to celebrate Marcus's transformation from successful executive to technology billionaire. The dress was perfectly appropriate for a supportive spouse, elegant but understated, designed to complement Marcus's triumph rather than compete for attention. Lydia had learned over the years to dress in ways that reinforced his narrative about their relationship, appearing successful enough to reflect well on him, while remaining safely secondary to his professional achievements. Tonight, that carefully cultivated image would serve a purpose that Marcus could never imagine. Downstairs, she could hear Marcus on yet another conference call with the acquisition team, his voice carrying the electric excitement of someone who believed himself on the verge of unprecedented success. The sale to Quantum Dynamics Corporation had been finalized that morning, valuing Nexus Technologies at $2.7 billion, based primarily on the revolutionary innovations that Marcus had claimed as his creative breakthroughs. The irony was so perfect that Lydia almost smiled as she applied her lipstick with steady hands. Marcus's greatest professional triumph was about to become the stage for his complete destruction, with 300 witnesses present to observe his humiliation. Diana had spent weeks orchestrating tonight's events with the precision of a military operation, ensuring that every element would be in place for the revelation that would end Marcus's career and potentially his freedom. As Lydia descended the curved staircase to their marble foyer, Marcus looked up from his phone with obvious pride. His custom tuxedo from Savile Row fit him perfectly, projecting the image of understated wealth and sophisticated success that he had cultivated so carefully throughout his career. The satisfied smile on his face suggested someone who had finally achieved everything he had ever wanted through his own brilliance and hard work. "You look beautiful tonight, darling," Marcus said, crossing the foyer to kiss her cheek with apparent affection. "I can't believe we're actually here, about to celebrate the biggest technology acquisition of the decade. When I think about all the years of work that led to this moment, all the innovations and breakthroughs that made tonight possible, I feel incredibly grateful for the journey we've taken together." Lydia smiled and squeezed his hand with what appeared to be loving support, her expression showing nothing but pride in her husband's remarkable achievements. But behind her calm exterior, she was thinking about the digital recorder in her purse, the one that Diana had provided to document anything Marcus might say tonight about his claimed innovations. Every false statement he made would become additional evidence in the federal case that was already being prepared against him. The ride to the St. Regis passed in comfortable silence, with Marcus reviewing his speech notes while Lydia gazed out at the San Francisco skyline. She had memorized every detail of tonight's schedule, knowing exactly when each key witness would arrive and where they would be positioned during Marcus's presentation. Diana had coordinated with remarkable precision, ensuring that the most important observers would have perfect vantage points for the revelation that would transform celebration into catastrophe. The hotel ballroom was magnificent, decorated with subtle lighting and floral arrangements that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables where technology executives, venture capital partners, and industry journalists mingled with the confident energy of people accustomed to shaping the future through financial firepower and strategic vision. Lydia recognized many of the faces from previous industry events, powerful figures whose opinions could make or break entire companies with casual comments or strategic investments. Margaret Sinclair was holding court near the bar, surrounded by eager entrepreneurs hoping to capture her attention for their own ventures. Dr. Harrison Webb stood with a group of academic colleagues. Their conversation clearly focused on the technical implications of Marcus's claimed innovations. But Lydia's attention was drawn to three individuals whose presence represented the culmination of weeks of careful preparation. Near the registration table, Dr. Elena Vasquez from the United States Patent and Trademark Office was checking in under the cover story that Diana had arranged. The patent examiner appeared to be simply another industry professional attending a major acquisition celebration, but her true purpose was documenting everything Marcus might say about innovations that were currently under federal investigation. At a corner table sat James Morrison, Diana's senior partner, who specialized in criminal intellectual property cases and had a reputation for destroying executives who thought their wealth made them untouchable. He was engaged in animated conversation with what appeared to be potential clients, but his real focus was preparing to witness testimony that could support federal prosecution for systematic patent fraud. The third key figure was Dr. Rebecca Chun, a forensic technology expert whose analysis of Lydia's evidence had confirmed beyond any doubt that Marcus's claimed innovations represented systematic theft of intellectual property worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She was positioned near the front of the room, ready to observe Marcus's presentation with the clinical expertise that could authenticate his false claims for a federal jury. As the evening progressed, Marcus worked the room with the confident charm that had characterized his entire career, accepting congratulations and discussing his vision for the future of artificial intelligence technology. Lydia watched him describe her stolen innovations to fascinated listeners, each false claim adding to the weight of evidence that would ultimately destroy him completely. The formal program began at 8:30, with Marcus introduced as the visionary genius whose revolutionary breakthroughs had transformed Nexus Technologies into one of the most valuable technology companies in the world. The applause was thunderous, reflecting genuine admiration for what appeared to be one of the most remarkable success stories in Silicon Valley history. Marcus took the stage with obvious pleasure, his confidence radiating across the ballroom as he began the presentation that would celebrate his transformation from successful executive to technology billionaire. The massive screens behind him displayed technical diagrams of the quantum sync processor and related innovations, each image representing stolen intellectual property that he was about to claim with unprecedented arrogance. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom through the professional sound system. Tonight represents the culmination of a journey that began 5 years ago in my home workshop, when I first recognized the potential for revolutionary advances in quantum classical processing architecture. Lydia felt her pulse quicken as Marcus began describing her breakthrough moments as his own inspired discoveries, each false claim being recorded by multiple witnesses who would soon understand the true magnitude of his fraud. She could see Dr. Vasquez taking careful notes, documenting every technical detail that Marcus presented as evidence of his creative genius. The inspiration for the quantum sync processor came during a late evening in my basement laboratory, when I was struggling with thermal management problems that had been frustrating the industry's best engineers for years. Marcus continued, his tone carrying the authority of someone sharing genuine personal experience. The breakthrough occurred when I realized that conventional cooling approaches were fundamentally flawed for parallel processing architectures that operate at quantum speeds. The description was a nearly perfect reproduction of Lydia's actual breakthrough moment, delivered with such convincing detail that even she might have been impressed if she didn't know the truth. Marcus had obviously rehearsed this narrative countless times, polishing his performance until he could present her discovery as his own inspired insight without any apparent consciousness of the theft he was committing. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes describing each major innovation in technical detail that demonstrated either remarkable research or access to the actual inventor's notes and prototypes. His presentation covered everything from the biomimetic heat distribution patterns to the quantum classical interface design, each explanation revealing knowledge that could only have come from Lydia's original development work. The audience was clearly impressed by the depth of Marcus's technical expertise, with several people asking sophisticated questions about implementation challenges and theoretical foundations. Marcus fielded each question with apparent mastery, displaying familiarity with concepts that required years of specialized study to understand properly. His performance was so convincing that even experts in the field seemed genuinely amazed by the breadth of his knowledge. But Lydia knew that Marcus's impressive technical fluency was entirely borrowed, memorized from her explanations and research notes rather than earned through actual understanding. His confidence was the confidence of an actor who had thoroughly studied his role, not the quiet certainty of someone who had actually solved the problems he was describing. The distinction would become crucial when his claims were examined by forensic experts who could distinguish between genuine expertise and sophisticated mimicry. As the formal presentation concluded, Marcus opened the floor for questions, clearly relishing the opportunity to demonstrate his command of technical details that had impressed even the most sophisticated observers. Dr. Webb raised his hand first, asking about the mathematical foundations underlying the quantum classical interface design. Harrison, that's an excellent question, Marcus replied with obvious pleasure, launching into a detailed explanation that reproduced Lydia's graduate-level research almost word for word. The mathematical framework required integrating concepts from multiple theoretical disciplines in ways that conventional approaches had never attempted. The breakthrough came when I realized that traditional models were constraining our thinking about quantum coherence in classical processing environments. Lydia watched Dr. Webb nod with genuine admiration, clearly impressed by what he interpreted as Marcus's remarkable theoretical sophistication. The academic had no reason to suspect that the confident explanation was entirely plagiarized, delivered by someone who understood the words without truly comprehending the underlying concepts that made them meaningful. Margaret Sinclair raised her hand next, asking about patent protection and intellectual property security for innovations that represented potential billions in licensing revenue. Her question was clearly focused on investment security, wanting assurance that Marcus's claimed breakthroughs were legally protected from competitors who might challenge their ownership. Margaret, I'm glad you asked about patent protection, Marcus responded with confident satisfaction. We have comprehensive legal documentation that establishes my exclusive ownership of every significant innovation that made tonight possible. Our intellectual property attorneys have created an airtight framework that would withstand any challenge to our ownership claims. The answer was delivered with such arrogant certainty that even Diana's carefully controlled expression showed a flicker of amazement at Marcus's spectacular overconfidence. He was publicly documenting his fraudulent claims in front of witnesses that included federal investigators, creating evidence that would make prosecution virtually automatic once his theft was revealed. As the question and answer session continued, Marcus became increasingly expansive in his claims, describing his innovation process with the detailed authority of someone sharing genuine creative experience. He talked about late-night breakthrough moments, technical challenges that had required months of patient experimentation, and theoretical insights that had emerged from years of dedicated research. Every word was stolen from Lydia's actual experience, transformed through Marcus's performance into evidence of his own creative genius. But his growing confidence was leading him toward the kind of spectacular overreach that Diana had anticipated, the moment when his arrogance would create legal vulnerability that could destroy him completely. The crucial moment came when a young journalist from TechCrunch asked about Marcus's advice for aspiring inventors who hoped to achieve similar breakthroughs in their own research. The question was clearly intended as a softball opportunity for inspirational commentary, but Marcus's response exceeded even Diana's most optimistic predictions for self-incriminating statements. Sarah, that's a wonderful question, and I'm always happy to share insights that might help the next generation of innovators, Marcus began, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone who genuinely believed himself qualified to offer technical guidance. The key to breakthrough innovation is understanding that most people think too small, too conventionally, about what's possible in their respective fields. Marcus paused for dramatic effect, clearly savoring the attention of 300 influential listeners hanging on his every word. The biggest mistake I see among aspiring inventors is their reluctance to challenge fundamental assumptions about how things work, he continued. True innovation requires the courage to reject conventional wisdom and explore approaches that others might consider impossible or impractical. The advice was perfectly generic and completely plagiarized from innovation literature that Marcus had obviously studied, but his delivery suggested someone sharing hard-earned wisdom from personal experience. His confidence was building toward the kind of spectacular arrogance that would make his eventual destruction even more satisfying for witnesses who were about to discover his complete fraud. In fact, Marcus continued with growing enthusiasm. I'd be happy to offer guidance to anyone here tonight who's working on technical challenges in quantum processing or related fields. Patent law can be quite complex for newcomers to the innovation process, and I'd be delighted to share some insights about proper documentation and legal protection strategies. The offer was made with such condescending generosity that several people in the audience exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the remarkable arrogance of someone who believed himself qualified to teach patent law to a room full of accomplished professionals. But Marcus was too intoxicated by his own performance to notice the subtle shift in atmosphere as his hubris reached dangerous levels. Dr. Vasquez raised her hand with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, her question designed to elicit the most damaging possible response from Marcus's inflated ego. "Mr. Blackwell," she said in a tone of apparent admiration, "your insights about patent documentation are fascinating. Could you elaborate on your experience with the USPTO examination process? I imagine someone with your level of innovation has extensive experience navigating federal patent requirements." Marcus's face lit up with obvious pleasure at the opportunity to display his supposed expertise in patent law, completely unaware that he was speaking to a senior patent examiner who could identify fraud with professional precision. His response would provide the final piece of evidence needed to support federal prosecution for systematic intellectual property theft. "Absolutely, Dr. Vasquez," Marcus replied with the confident authority of someone who believed himself an expert on subjects he had never actually studied. The USPTO examination process can be quite intimidating for first-time inventors, but once you understand the system's requirements, it becomes a powerful tool for protecting your intellectual property. The key is providing comprehensive technical documentation that establishes both the novelty and the commercial applications of your innovations. Lydia felt her heart pounding as she watched Marcus dig his own grave with unprecedented enthusiasm, creating evidence that would satisfy even the most skeptical prosecutor. His arrogant confidence was transforming him from protected executive into vulnerable criminal defendant, with 300 witnesses observing his systematic documentation of fraudulent claims. The trap was set perfectly, with every element in place for the revelation that would transform Marcus's greatest triumph into his complete destruction. All that remained was the moment when Dr. Vasquez would reveal her true identity and present the evidence that would end his career, his freedom, and everything he had built on the foundation of Lydia's stolen genius. The moment had arrived with the precision of a surgical strike, timed perfectly to maximize the impact of revelation on an audience that had gathered to celebrate what they believed was one of the greatest innovation success stories in Silicon Valley history. Dr. Elena Vasquez rose from her seat with deliberate grace, her movement commanding immediate attention from the 300 influential observers who had been hanging on Marcus's every word about patent law expertise. The ballroom fell silent with the peculiar hush that occurs when powerful people sense that something significant is about to unfold. Marcus stood at the podium with confident satisfaction, clearly believing that his impressive display of technical knowledge had cemented his reputation as both innovative genius and legal sophisticate. His smile suggested someone who had just delivered a masterful performance to exactly the audience that mattered most for his continued success. Dr. Vasquez walked toward the front of the ballroom with the measured pace of someone who understood the dramatic value of building tension before delivering information that would shatter everything the audience believed they knew. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something in her bearing that suggested authority far beyond what anyone had previously recognized. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "thank you for that fascinating discussion of patent documentation and USPTO procedures. Your insights have been quite illuminating, particularly your confidence in teaching others about intellectual property law and federal patent requirements." Marcus nodded graciously, clearly interpreting her comment as additional validation of his expertise. He had no reason to suspect that Dr. Vasquez was anything other than another impressed industry professional seeking to benefit from his hard-earned knowledge about innovation and legal protection strategies. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez," she continued, her voice taking on a tone of official authority that made several people in the audience lean forward with sudden attention. "I'm a senior patent examiner with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and I've been conducting a comprehensive investigation into the intellectual property claims that form the foundation of tonight's celebration." The words hit the ballroom like a physical force, creating a ripple of shocked silence that seemed to drain the oxygen from the air. Marcus's confident expression froze on his face as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. The woman he had been patronizingly instructing about patent law was actually a federal investigator whose job was identifying and prosecuting exactly the kind of fraud he had been committing for years. Margaret Sinclair's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, her sophisticated composure cracking as she realized that the acquisition celebration had just transformed into something far more serious than a business announcement. Dr. Webb's academic colleagues exchanged alarmed glances, their scholarly discussion about technical innovations suddenly taking on legal implications that none of them had anticipated. Marcus's mouth opened and closed silently as he struggled to process the complete reversal of his situation. One moment, he had been the confident genius sharing his expertise with admiring colleagues, and the next, he was a fraud suspect facing federal investigation in front of the most important witnesses in his professional world. Dr. Vasquez reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder that she opened with practiced efficiency. The contents represented months of investigation that had been conducted with the thoroughness that only federal law enforcement could provide. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence had been authenticated by forensic experts who specialized in intellectual property crimes. Mr. Blackwell, over the past 6 weeks our office has conducted an extensive investigation into the 17 patent applications you have filed claiming exclusive ownership of revolutionary innovations in quantum classical processing technology, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of official government authority. Our investigation was initiated based on evidence provided by the actual inventor of these technologies, evidence that establishes a clear pattern of systematic intellectual property theft spanning multiple years. The silence in the ballroom was complete now, broken only by the sound of expensive fountain pens dropping onto linen tablecloths, as industry leaders realized they were witnessing the exposure of one of the most significant fraud cases in technology history. The acquisition celebration had transformed into a federal investigation reveal, with 300 of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley serving as witnesses to Marcus's professional destruction. Dr. Vasquez lifted the first document from her folder, holding it high enough for everyone in the ballroom to see the official USPTO letterhead that commanded immediate respect from anyone familiar with intellectual property law. This is patent application number 16,891,247, filed by Marcus Blackwell on March 15, 2022, claiming exclusive ownership of revolutionary thermal management systems for parallel processing architectures, she announced clearly. Marcus's face had gone pale as he recognized the specific patent application that had been one of his first major thefts of Lydia's innovations. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his exposure in front of an audience that included potential investors, business partners, and industry journalists who would ensure that his humiliation became public knowledge. However, Dr. Vasquez continued with devastating precision. Our forensic investigation has established that the actual inventor of this technology is Mrs. Lydia Chun Blackwell, whose original research notes, prototype documentation, and development timeline clearly predate Mr. Blackwell's patent application by 18 months. The evidence includes time-stamped digital files, witnessed prototype demonstrations, and detailed technical specifications that match the patent claims with mathematical precision. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom as 300 sophisticated observers began to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. The woman they had dismissed as Marcus's supportive spouse was actually the hidden genius behind innovations worth billions of dollars, while the man they had celebrated as a visionary breakthrough artist was nothing more than a sophisticated intellectual property thief. Dr. Vasquez lifted another document, this one showing technical diagrams that several audience members recognized from Marcus's earlier presentations. Patent application number 16,934,158, filed by Marcus Blackwell on July 8, 2022, claiming exclusive ownership of quantum classical interface design innovations, she announced. Again, our investigation has established that Mrs. Chun Blackwell is the actual inventor, with original sketches and calculations dating to November 2021, 8 months before Mr. Blackwell's fraudulent filing. Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged as a strangled whisper that carried none of his earlier confidence. "This is completely ridiculous," he stammered, his usual smooth authority replaced by desperate confusion. Lydia is my wife. We work together on everything. These are collaborative innovations that represent our shared creative process, not individual ownership claims. Dr. Vasquez regarded him with the clinical detachment of someone who had heard every possible defense from caught fraudsters. Mr. Blackwell, she replied coldly, federal patent law does not recognize marital collaboration as grounds for fraudulent filing. Each patent application requires sworn statements identifying the actual inventor, and knowingly filing false claims constitutes federal fraud regardless of personal relationships with the true inventor. The legal terminology hung in the air with the weight of federal prosecution, transforming Marcus from respected executive into criminal defendant in the space of a few devastating sentences. Margaret Sinclair's investment calculations were rapidly shifting from profit projections to damage control strategies, while Dr. Webb's academic admiration had curdled into professional disgust at the magnitude of fraud he had unknowingly endorsed. Dr. Vasquez continued methodically through the evidence, each patent application revealing another layer of Marcus's systematic theft from his wife's brilliant innovations. Patent after patent, innovation after innovation, the evidence painted a picture of intellectual property crime so extensive that it defied rational comprehension. Marcus had stolen everything from minor efficiency improvements to revolutionary breakthroughs, building his entire reputation on work that belonged to someone else. The most damaging revelation came when Dr. Vasquez presented the financial analysis that showed how Marcus had monetized Lydia's stolen innovations for personal gain. The evidence included promotion announcements, salary increases, stock options, and consulting fees that Marcus had received based directly on presenting her work as his own creative genius. The dollar amounts were staggering, representing millions in fraudulent compensation obtained through systematic deception. Our investigation has also revealed, Dr. Vasquez announced with clinical precision, that Mr. Blackwell has engaged legal representation to establish intellectual property licensing agreements worth an estimated $400 million, all based on technologies that he has fraudulently claimed as his exclusive inventions. This represents commercial fraud on a scale that triggers mandatory federal prosecution under intellectual property crime statutes. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the full scope of Marcus's criminality became clear to everyone present. This was not merely a case of taking credit for collaborative work, but systematic theft designed to generate enormous personal wealth through fraudulent claims. Marcus had built his entire fortune on stolen intellectual property, transforming his wife's genius into his own financial empire through carefully orchestrated deception. Marcus's desperate attempts at explanation became increasingly incoherent as he struggled to maintain his innocence in the face of overwhelming federal evidence. But his words carried no weight against the systematic documentation that Dr. Vasquez presented with devastating effectiveness. Every defense he offered was immediately contradicted by forensic analysis that established timeline, ownership, and fraudulent intent beyond any reasonable doubt. The final moment of complete reversal came when Dr. Vasquez called Lydia to join her at the front of the ballroom. For the first time in years, every eye in the room was focused on the quiet woman who had been systematically erased from the narrative of innovation success. But instead of the supportive spouse they expected, they saw someone whose calm confidence suggested depths of knowledge and capability that had been hidden behind carefully constructed modesty. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Vasquez announced, I present Mrs. Lydia Chun Blackwell, the actual inventor of every innovation that has been celebrated tonight, the true genius behind technologies that promise to revolutionize artificial intelligence processing, and the victim of one of the most extensive intellectual property theft cases in federal prosecution history. The applause that followed was unlike anything the ballroom had heard before, driven not by celebration of business success, but by recognition of justice finally being served. 300 influential observers rose to their feet in acknowledgement of brilliance that had been stolen and hidden, genius that had been exploited and denied recognition for years of systematic abuse. Marcus stood alone at the podium, his empire crumbling around him as the truth finally emerged from years of carefully maintained deception. Everything he had built, every success he had claimed, every dollar he had earned was revealed as the product of fraud so systematic that it guaranteed his complete destruction through federal prosecution. The acquisition deal was dead before the applause ended, with Quantum Dynamics Corporation representatives already making calls to legal teams who would ensure that their company avoided any connection to the massive fraud that had just been exposed. Marcus's career was finished, his reputation destroyed, his freedom threatened by federal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. But for Lydia, standing in the spotlight that had finally found its rightful target, the moment represented something far more valuable than revenge. It was vindication, recognition, and the beginning of a future where her genius would be acknowledged and celebrated rather than stolen and hidden. Justice had finally arrived, and its impact would be felt throughout Silicon Valley for years to come. The aftermath unfolded with the swift brutality that only complete exposure can deliver to someone whose entire existence has been built on carefully constructed lies. Within minutes of Dr. Vasquez's revelation, Marcus found himself standing alone at the podium, while 300 of Silicon Valley's most influential figures turned away from him, with the collective revulsion typically reserved for discovering something rotting beneath a beautiful surface. The Quantum Dynamics Corporation representatives were the first to act, their legal team already on emergency conference calls that would ensure their company avoided any association with what was clearly going to become one of the most publicized fraud cases in technology industry history. The acquisition deal that had been worth $2.7 billion that morning was dead before the ballroom lights were fully raised, killed by evidence so overwhelming that no amount of legal maneuvering could resurrect it. Margaret Sinclair approached Lydia with the calculated precision of someone whose survival in venture capital depended on recognizing shifts in power dynamics before they became obvious to lesser players. "Mrs. Chen Blackwell," she said, her voice carrying genuine respect for the first time since they had met, "I owe you an apology for not recognizing your contributions earlier. More importantly, I'd like to discuss investment opportunities that would allow you to commercialize your innovations under your own leadership rather than through intermediaries who clearly don't deserve to profit from your genius." The conversation that followed established the foundation for what would become Lydia's independent technology company, funded by investors who understood that they were backing the actual source of innovations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Margaret's firm committed to providing series of funding that would allow Lydia to build her own empire rather than remaining dependent on organizations that had enabled Marcus's systematic theft. Dr. Webb's reaction was equally swift and far more personally satisfying for Lydia, who had endured years of academic dismissal from someone whose expertise she had always respected. "Dr. Chen Blackwell," he said, his embarrassment obvious as he struggled to find words adequate to the situation, "I cannot express how mortified I am to have participated in celebrating stolen work. Your innovations represent breakthrough thinking that deserves recognition from the entire academic community, and I would be honored to help arrange presentations at major universities where your research can receive the serious scholarly attention it merits." The academic rehabilitation that Dr. Webb offered represented something even more valuable than financial investment: the restoration of Lydia's intellectual reputation among people whose opinions had always mattered more to her than business success. Within weeks, she would be delivering keynote presentations at Stanford, MIT, and Caltech, finally receiving recognition from the scholarly community that had been denied to her, while Marcus claimed credit for her revolutionary thinking. But the most satisfying immediate consequence was watching the systematic abandonment of Marcus by every professional ally who had supported his fraudulent claims. Dr. Evelyn Torres, the patent attorney who had helped Marcus steal Lydia's innovations, was among the first to distance herself from the scandal with statements about client confidentiality and limited knowledge of invention timelines. The legal team that had seemed so sophisticated in protecting Marcus's stolen intellectual property suddenly appeared incompetent and potentially complicit in federal fraud. Marcus himself had been escorted from the ballroom by hotel security after his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his innocence had devolved into incoherent accusations that Lydia was somehow conspiring against him. His final public appearance of the evening involved being photographed by industry journalists as he was removed from his own celebration, his tuxedo disheveled and his face showing the kind of panic that comes from watching an entire life's work exposed as systematic deception. The legal consequences materialized with remarkable speed once federal investigators had access to the evidence that Diana Reeves had been organizing for months. Within 72 hours of the ballroom revelation, Marcus was facing 17 counts of federal patent fraud, each carrying potential sentences that could result in decades of imprisonment. The charges were accompanied by asset freezer orders that prevented him from accessing wealth obtained through his fraudulent claims, leaving him financially devastated while legal bills accumulated with devastating efficiency. The criminal prosecution was only the beginning of Marcus's legal nightmare, as civil lawsuits from investors, business partners, and Nexus Technologies itself created liability exposure that would ensure his financial destruction even if he somehow avoided prison time. The company immediately terminated his employment and announced a comprehensive investigation into every innovation he had claimed, seeking to distance themselves from fraud that threatened their entire business model. Nexus Technologies' response to the scandal was both swift and strategically brilliant, demonstrating the kind of crisis management that could transform potential catastrophe into competitive advantage. The board of directors issued a public apology acknowledging that they had been deceived by Marcus's fraudulent claims and announced their intention to make full restitution to the actual inventor whose work had been systematically stolen. The centerpiece of their rehabilitation strategy was offering Lydia the position of Chief Technology Officer, with full authority over innovation strategy and intellectual property development. The role came with an executive compensation package that reflected the true value of her contributions, including equity positions that would make her independently wealthy regardless of any civil judgments against Marcus. Lydia's acceptance of the CTO position represented the completion of a transformation that went far beyond simple revenge into genuine professional vindication. For the first time in her career, she would be leading technology development under her own name, with resources and recognition commensurate with her actual capabilities rather than her husband's fraudulent claims. Her first act as CTO was establishing new protocols for intellectual property documentation that would prevent future theft while ensuring that actual inventors received appropriate credit and compensation for their contributions. The policies became industry standard within months, cited by other technology companies seeking to avoid the kind of scandal that had destroyed Marcus's reputation and nearly bankrupted Nexus Technologies. The media coverage of the scandal was extensive and uniformly damaging to Marcus, while celebrating Lydia's emergence as one of the most innovative minds in artificial intelligence development. Technology publications that had previously featured Marcus as a visionary genius published detailed profiles of Lydia's actual research process, her educational background, and her plans for revolutionizing quantum classical processing architecture under her own leadership. The contrast between the coverage was particularly devastating for Marcus, whose previous media appearances were now analyzed as evidence of his sophisticated deception rather than impressive expertise. Journalists who had been fooled by his performance felt personally betrayed and pursued follow-up stories that documented every aspect of his systematic fraud with the thoroughness that only investigative reporting could provide. 6 months after the ballroom revelation, the long-term consequences of that evening had reshaped multiple lives with the permanence that only complete exposure can achieve. Marcus was serving a federal prison sentence that would keep him incarcerated for the next 15 years, his appeals exhausted and his reputation destroyed so completely that rehabilitation was impossible even if he eventually regained his freedom. His financial destruction was equally complete, with civil judgments and legal fees consuming every asset he had accumulated through his fraudulent claims. The mansion he had purchased with stolen innovation profits was sold to pay restitution, while his luxury cars, investment portfolios, and art collection were liquidated to satisfy court orders that would continue generating payment obligations for decades beyond his prison release. But the most psychologically devastating consequence for Marcus was watching Lydia's continued success from his prison cell, where news coverage of her achievements served as daily reminders of the genius he had stolen and the empire she was building under her own name. Her innovations were transforming entire industries, while generating wealth that dwarfed anything he had ever achieved through deception. Lydia's technology company had grown into one of the most valuable startups in Silicon Valley history, with innovations that extended far beyond her original quantum classical processing breakthroughs into artificial intelligence applications that promised to revolutionize everything from medical diagnostics to climate modeling. Her name appeared on dozens of new patents that established her as one of the most prolific inventors of her generation. The academic recognition she had always craved followed her commercial success, with honorary doctorates from major universities and research appointments that allowed her to influence the next generation of innovators. She frequently spoke about the importance of intellectual honesty and proper attribution, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of systematic deception in scientific and technological development. The final measure of justice came when Lydia received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, the highest honor that the United States government can bestow on civilian inventors. The ceremony was attended by technology leaders, government officials, and academic researchers who recognized her contributions as transformative advances that would benefit humanity for generations. Standing on the stage where presidents and Nobel Prize winners had been honored, Lydia felt the profound satisfaction that comes from achieving recognition through genuine merit rather than stolen credit. Her acceptance speech focused on the importance of supporting authentic innovation while protecting inventors from the kind of exploitation that had nearly destroyed her career before justice finally prevailed. The medal represented more than personal vindication. It was proof that truth eventually emerges no matter how sophisticated the deception designed to hide it. Marcus's arrogance had created the evidence that destroyed him while elevating the woman whose genius he had tried to steal and claim as his own achievement. In her private moments, Lydia sometimes thought about the ironic perfection of how everything had unfolded. Marcus's greatest professional triumph had become the stage for his complete destruction, his stolen innovations providing the evidence that proved his systematic fraud. His confidence in his own invulnerability had prevented him from recognizing that the quiet wife he dismissed and exploited possessed both the brilliance and the documentation to demolish everything he had built on her stolen genius. The workshop where she had created her revolutionary innovations was now a properly equipped laboratory where she continued developing technologies that pushed the boundaries of what artificial intelligence could achieve. But instead of working in secret while someone else claimed credit for her breakthroughs, she led teams of brilliant researchers who understood that they were participating in discoveries that would be attributed to their actual contributions. Every morning when Lydia arrived at her office, she passed a wall displaying her patents, awards, and recognition from scientific organizations around the world. The display served as a daily reminder of how far she had come from the invisible spouse who had watched her life's work being stolen and presented as someone else's genius. Marcus would spend the next decade watching her continued success from federal prison, his stolen empire replaced by her authentic achievements while his name became synonymous with the kind of fraud that could destroy even the most successful career. The man who had taught her that power came from controlling information and manipulating perceptions had learned too late that truth possesses a power that no amount of deception can ultimately overcome. Justice had been served with the kind of poetic precision that transforms personal vindication into universal satisfaction, proving that brilliance combined with patience can overcome even the most systematic exploitation when the moment for revelation finally arrives. Have you ever had someone take credit for your work or ideas? Whether it happened in school, at your job, or in your personal life, share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help others recognize when their own contributions are being stolen and find the courage to fight back against people who think they can build success on other people's genius.